Millionaire invites humble waitress to luxury party to humiliate her. But when she arrives, he and all the guests are in shock. Hello and welcome to 80s Love Stories, where I, your favorite narrator, Christopher, bring you an exciting love story straight from the unforgettable 1980s. Get ready for a journey full of nostalgia and incredible twists. Today's story is truly remarkable, with an ending that's sure to touch your heart and leave you amazed. So, stay with me until the very last moment. I hope this experience is unforgettable for you, and may God bless you and your family. Now, let's get started. It was 1983, and Sarah worked double shifts at Mel's Diner, a modest establishment on the outskirts of Boston. Her blonde hair tied back in a messy ponytail, her pink uniform showing signs of wear. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing plates and managing endless coffee refills. The diner's bell chimed as another customer entered. Through the window, Sarah glimpsed a sleek black Mercedes-Benz pulling away, a rare sight in this working-class neighborhood. The man who entered wore an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. He sat at the counter, looking oddly out of place among the regular crowd of truck drivers and factory workers. "Coffee, black," he said, without looking up from his leather briefcase. His voice carried the polished accent of old money and private schools. Sarah poured his coffee, noting his manicured hands and the gold Rolex on his wrist. He finally looked up, and their eyes met. There was something cold in his gaze that made her uncomfortable. "Anderson, Richard Anderson," he said, studying her as if she were an interesting specimen. "You're quite pretty for a waitress." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger at his condescending tone. "Says, will there be anything else, sir?" He pulled an elegant envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the counter. "I'm hosting a party this Saturday at my estate. Black tie, very exclusive. You should come." Sarah stared at the invitation, confusion written across her face. "I don't understand." "Consider it a social experiment," Richard said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Let's see how a simple waitress handles herself among Boston's elite. It could be entertaining." Before Sarah could respond, he stood up, leaving his coffee untouched and a $100 bill on the counter. "Keep the change. You'll need something suitable to wear." As he walked out, Sarah held the invitation, her hands trembling with a mixture of humiliation and anger. She knew he was mocking her, inviting her just to watch her stumble and make a fool of herself. Part of her wanted to tear up the invitation and forget it ever happened. But another part of her, the part that had fought against every obstacle life had thrown her way, that had put herself through night school while working full-time, that part whispered, "Show him how wrong he is." What Richard Anderson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah Carter wasn't just any waitress. She had a secret that would turn his cruel game completely upside down. Sarah's tiny apartment above the record store buzzed with the sound of Madonna's Holiday, playing from her neighbor's stereo. She sat at her scratched kitchen table, the elegant invitation propped against an empty coffee mug, its cream-colored paper almost glowing under the flickering fluorescent light. "You're not actually going, are you?" asked Jenny, her co-worker and best friend since high school, twirling the cord of the wall-mounted telephone. The bright yellow plastic matched the kitchen's dated wallpaper. "That Richard Anderson is notorious. Did you hear what he did to that boutique owner on Newbury Street? Invited her to one of his parties just to mock her fashion sense in front of everyone." Sarah cradled the receiver between her ear and shoulder as she opened an old wooden chest she kept under her bed. "That's exactly why I have to go, Jenny. Men like him think they can toy with people's lives just because they have money." She pulled out a carefully preserved box, its contents hidden beneath layers of tissue paper. "But what are you going to wear? You can't show up in anything from Woolworths to a black tie event at Anderson Manor." Jenny's voice crackled with concern through the telephone line. Sarah smiled, running her fingers over the box. "Don't worry about that. Remember how I told you about my grandmother, the one who taught me everything I know? The one from Newport. You barely talk about her. That's because it's complicated." Sarah lifted the lid, revealing something that made her catch her breath. Despite having seen it dozens of times before, she wasn't just from Newport. She was Newport. Inside the box lay an evening gown that spoke of another era, a masterpiece of vintage Dior from the late 1950s, its midnight blue silk still perfect, its beading still catching the light like stars. But it wasn't just any dress, it was a dress with a story. A dress that had graced ballrooms and yacht clubs, a dress that held secrets. "My grandmother was Elizabeth Canterbury," Sarah said quietly. Knowing the weight that name still carried in certain circles, Jenny gasped. The Elizabeth Canterbury? Of the Newport Canterburys. But they were one of the oldest families in Rhode Island society, yes? But then came the scandal, the family split, and my mother chose love over luxury. She married my father, a jazz musician, and was cut off completely. Sarah carefully lifted the dress from its resting place. Grandmother secretly kept in touch with me, though she taught me everything. Which fork to use, how to waltz, how to navigate a ballroom full of sharks in evening wear. The dress represented more than fabric and thread. It was a reminder of weekend afternoons spent in her grandmother's secluded cottage, learning the intricate steps of social dances, the proper way to hold a champagne flute, how to make polite conversation while conveying volumes in subtle undertones, all the things that Richard Anderson assumed she couldn't possibly know. She passed away last year, Sarah continued, her voice soft with memory. Left me her personal collection of evening wear and her journals. Said I might need them someday. I think she knew, somehow she knew, that I'd eventually find my way back into that world, even if just for one night. As Sarah held the dress up to the light, memories flooded back. The scent of her grandmother's Chanel No. 5, the sound of orchestra music playing on the old record player, the feel of aged silk under her fingertips as she learned to distinguish quality from mere show. Elizabeth Canterbury might have been ostracized from society, but she never lost her dignity, her knowledge, or her impeccable taste. The week leading up to the party was a careful orchestration of preparation. Sarah spent her evenings practicing the skills she hadn't used in years. She waltzed with an imaginary partner in her small living room, dodging the second-hand furniture. She rehearsed the proper handling of every piece of cutlery she might encounter, though her own drawer held only mismatched flatware from the 5 and dime. The local library provided recent copies of Town and Country and the Boston Globe's society pages, where she studied up on the current dynamics of Boston's upper crust. Richard Anderson featured prominently, his business dealings, his social circles, his reputation for using his parties to establish dominance over perceived rivals. "He's trying to humiliate me because he can," Sarah told her reflection as she pinned her hair up in the same elegant style her grandmother had taught her. "He sees a waitress and assumes he knows my whole story. But grandmother always said that true grace isn't about having everything, it's about carrying yourself with dignity, no matter what you have." The night before the party, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching the streetlights flicker through the early autumn fog. Somewhere across the city, in his mansion on Beacon Hill, Richard Anderson was probably congratulating himself on his clever little game. He'd expect her to arrive in some desperate attempt at elegance, probably something polyester from the mall, with costume jewelry and shoes from Payless. What he couldn't know was that Sarah had spent her entire life preparing for a moment like this, though she hadn't realized it until now. Every lesson from her grandmother, every story about the social seasons of the past, every detail about which families had old money and which were nouveau riche. It was all carefully preserved in her memory, waiting to be used. She touched the blue silk of the Dior gown, now hanging carefully on her closet door. The dress wasn't just beautiful, it was a piece of social history. Anyone who really knew fashion would recognize it as the centerpiece of Dior's 1957 winter collection. Only 3 were ever made in this particular shade of midnight blue. One was purchased by a European princess, one by a Hollywood star, and one by Elizabeth Canterbury. Sarah smiled, remembering her grandmother's words. "In society, dear, knowledge is power, but kindness is everything. Never let them make you bitter. Just show them who you really are, and let that be enough." Tomorrow night, Richard Anderson would learn that some waitresses knew more about his world than he could possibly imagine. But Sarah wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. She had something far more powerful in mind. She would meet his cruelty with grace, his condescension with dignity, and his attempt at humiliation with genuine kindness. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that the party would change her life in ways she never expected, and that Richard Anderson's carefully planned social experiment was about to backfire spectacularly. Saturday evening arrived with a crispness typical of early autumn in Boston. Sarah stepped out of the taxi in front of Anderson Manor, its Georgian brick facade illuminated by carefully positioned spotlights. A line of luxury cars stretched down the circular driveway, Jaguars, BMWs, and Mercedes-Benzes gleaming under the security lights. The vintage Dior moved with her like liquid midnight, its beading catching the light with every step. She'd styled her hair in a classic French twist, accented only by her grandmother's small pearl earrings. No necklace. Elizabeth had always said that with a dress like this, the décolletage should remain unadorned. As she handed her invitation to the doorman, Sarah caught snippets of conversation from arriving guests, their voices carrying familiar touches of Beacon Hill and Back Bay accents. "Did you hear Anderson's planning to acquire that new tech firm in Cambridge? Barbara, darling, you must tell me who does your face now. Dr. Peterson's work is becoming so obvious. I heard he invited some waitress tonight. Can you imagine?" Sarah felt their sideways glances, their barely concealed curiosity. She responded with the slight, knowing smile her grandmother had perfected, the one that suggested she knew far more than she was letting on. The grand foyer opened into a ballroom that could have been transplanted directly from Versailles. A chamber orchestra played Strauss from a corner alcove, competing with the murmur of 200 of Boston's most influential citizens. The air was heavy with Givenchy, Chanel, and old money. Richard Anderson stood near a marble fireplace, holding court amid a circle of admirers. His tuxedo was impeccable, his manner commanding. When he saw Sarah, his expression shifted from practiced charm to momentary confusion. She watched as his eyes traveled from her perfectly styled hair to the unmistakable elegance of the vintage Dior. His brow furrowed slightly. This wasn't the awkward, overwhelmed waitress he'd expected. "Miss Carter," he said as she approached, his tone caught between condescension and uncertainty. "How unexpected. That's quite a remarkable dress." "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Original Dior, winter collection of '57. My grandmother always said it was one of Christian's finest years, though some argued that spring '56 was superior." She delivered the words casually, as if discussing the weather. A woman in red silk turned sharply. "Your grandmother was familiar with Dior's collections?" "Oh yes," Sarah smiled, accepting a champagne flute from a passing waiter with perfect form. So Elizabeth Canterbury was quite passionate about fashion. The name dropped like a stone into still water. Ripples of recognition moved through the nearby crowd. Richard's carefully maintained expression cracked for just a moment. "Canterbury?" An elderly woman in heavy diamonds stepped forward. "Elizabeth Canterbury. I knew Elizabeth. We danced at the same debutante ball in '38, but she disappeared from society after my mother married a jazz musician." "Yes, quite the scandal at the time, I'm told." Sarah's voice carried no bitterness, only a hint of amusement. Grandmother always said love was worth any price. The next hour was a masterclass in social navigation. Sarah moved through the crowd with practiced ease, dropping precisely the right references, asking after the right families, sharing carefully chosen anecdotes about Newport summers that only someone who'd been taught by an insider would know. She noticed Richard watching her, his expression growing increasingly complex. This wasn't the entertainment he'd planned. Instead of a fumbling waitress to mock, he found himself facing someone who could have been born to this world, who, in fact, had been. During a lull in the music, Richard approached her again. "You're full of surprises, Miss Carter." "Life usually is, Mr. Anderson." She met his gaze steadily. "Although I admit I'm curious why you chose to invite me tonight. Surely not just to mock a waitress who serves you coffee?" For the first time, she saw something like genuine emotion flicker across his face, embarrassment, perhaps, or shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly gentleman with sharp eyes and a military bearing. "Richard, my boy, who is this enchanting young woman? She reminds me so much of—" The old man stopped, studying Sarah's face intently. "Mr. Canterbury," Sarah said softly, recognizing him from her grandmother's photographs. "You look just as grandmother Elizabeth described. The old man's face went pale. Good God, you're Helen's daughter, Elizabeth's granddaughter. Richard looked between them, realization dawning. Uncle James, you know her family. Know them? James Canterbury's laugh was bitter and wet with emotion. Your mother was my daughter's best friend, Richard, before the family split, before we all let pride tear us apart. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Sarah stared at Richard, pieces falling into place. The world of old money and social connections was smaller than anyone liked to admit. So of course there would be connections, tangled threads of history linking their families. You didn't know, she said to Richard. It wasn't a question. No, he admitted, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. I knew Uncle James had family drama years ago, but I never knew the details. I saw you at the diner, and something about you. He trailed off, looking lost for the first time since she'd met him. The orchestra had started playing again. Moon River, of all things. James Canterbury's eyes were wet with tears. That was their song, he said quietly. Your parents. They danced to it the night they met, at the Newport Jazz Festival, the night everything changed. The night air had grown cooler as guests spilled out onto the terrace. Inside, the orchestra played Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper, transformed into an elegant waltz that somehow maintained the song's wistful longing. Sarah stood at the balustrade, watching her breath form delicate clouds in the autumn air. Richard found her there, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He'd loosened his bow tie slightly, the first crack in his perfect facade she'd seen all evening. I believe I owe you several apologies, he said, offering her one of the glasses. Just one will do, Sarah replied, accepting the champagne. But I'd like to understand why. Why invite me here to humiliate me? He leaned against the stone railing, looking out over the carefully manicured gardens. I saw you at the diner every morning for weeks. You were different. The way you carried yourself, how you treated everyone with such genuine kindness. Even me when I was being deliberately awful. He paused, taking a sip of champagne. It made me angry. Angry because I was kind. Because you were happy, genuinely happy, working in a diner, living a simple life, while I... He gestured at the mansion, the party, all the trappings of wealth. I haven't been happy since 1979. Sarah studied his profile in the dim light. What happened in 1979? My father died. Suddenly, I was responsible for everything. The company, the family name, the legacy. I was 24 and terrified, but terror isn't allowed in our world. So I became... this. He waved a hand at himself, at the perfectly tailored tuxedo and carefully maintained expression. Inside, someone had put on a record, Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart, playing through expensive speakers, the sound drifting out to where they stood. I remember when this song came out, Sarah said softly. I was working double shifts, trying to pay for night classes. There was this little radio at the diner, and every time it played, no matter how tired we were, everyone would sing along, even the grumpy regulars who complained about everything else. Richard turned to look at her. What were you studying? Art history. She smiled at his surprised expression. Another gift from grandmother. She taught me about more than just society manners. Every Sunday, she'd show me her art books, tell me stories about the paintings, the artists. I wanted to work in a museum, help others see the beauty she showed me. Did you finish? 2 classes short. The diner owner got sick, had to cut staff. I needed full-time hours more than I needed Renaissance art. There was no bitterness in her voice, just simple statement of fact. Richard was quiet for a long moment. So Uncle James wants to talk to you about your mother, your grandmother. He's been living with regret for 30 years. I know. Grandmother did too. She kept every letter he sent, though she never answered them. Pride and fear. They're quite a combination. A new song started playing inside, Against All Odds, by Phil Collins. Several couples had moved onto the dance floor, swaying to the emotional lyrics. Would you dance with me? Richard asked suddenly. Not because of who your grandmother was or who my family is. Just because you're you and I'm actually quite terrible at dancing. Sarah laughed, a real laugh. not the polite society titter she'd been using all evening. "You! Terrible at dancing, I don't believe it!" "It's true. Father insisted I learn, but I have 2 left feet. It's my darkest secret." His smile was different now, warmer, genuine, although I suspect you could teach me a thing or two. Grandmother always said the key to dancing isn't in the feet, it's in the heart. Sarah set down her champagne glass. Shall we test that theory? As Richard led her to the dance floor, she noticed the other guests watching them, some with surprise, others with calculating interest, but for the first time that evening, she didn't care what they thought. The night had taken an unexpected turn, revealing layers of connection and coincidence that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Yet here they were, surrounded by the echoes of decisions made decades ago, while the music of their own era played on. Uncle James watched them from across the room, his eyes glistening with tears he wouldn't let fall. In Richard's awkward but earnest attempts to lead, in Sarah's patient guidance, he saw echoes of another couple who had danced to different music, who had chosen love over tradition, who had sparked a family rift that had lasted far too long. As they danced, Sarah began to realize that perhaps her grandmother's lessons hadn't just been about surviving in this world of wealth and privilege. Maybe they had been about something more, about healing old wounds, about bringing people together, about showing that love and kindness could bridge any gap. But there was still something Richard wasn't telling her, something hidden behind his newfound vulnerability. Whatever it was, Sarah sensed it would change everything. Again. After their dance, Richard led Sarah to a quieter part of the mansion, a wood-paneled library that smelled of leather and old books. The walls were lined with first editions, and a collection of vinyl records sat near a high-end turntable. He selected one, Simon & Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, and placed the needle carefully. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice tight with tension, "about why I really invited you here tonight." Sarah sat in a leather armchair, the midnight blue Dior pooling around her like water. "I'm listening." "That morning at the diner wasn't the first time I saw you." Richard paced near the fireplace, his reflection dancing in the dark windows. "I've been going there for months, watching you, because my father left a letter." He pulled an envelope from his desk drawer, the paper yellowed with age. "He wrote this the day before he died. I was supposed to receive it on my 30th birthday, but the family lawyer held on to it until last month." Sarah took the letter with careful hands. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky, as if written by someone struggling to hold the pen. "My dearest son," she read aloud, "there are mistakes in life that haunt us forever. Mine was letting pride destroy not one family, but 2. Your mother wasn't my first love." Before her, there was a jazz singer named Marie. She was everything society said I couldn't have. I chose duty over love, breaking both our hearts. She married another musician, Thomas Carter. Sarah's hands began to shake. "Thomas Carter. My father." "Keep reading," Richard whispered. "What I never told anyone," Sarah continued reading, "was that before I ended things with Marie, there was one perfect night. 9 months later, she had a daughter, Helen, your half-sister, though she never knew. I watched from afar as Helen grew up, married a musician like her mother, had a daughter of her own, my granddaughter, who I could never claim." The letter dropped from Sarah's trembling fingers. "No, this can't—" "You're my niece, Sarah." Richard's voice cracked. "When I saw you at the diner, it was like seeing Helen's photos from the society pages before she left it all behind. I was cruel because I was angry. At my father for his secrets, at myself for not knowing how to make this right." Sarah stood abruptly, the Dior rustling. "Does James know?" "No. No one knows except me, and now you." Richard picked up the fallen letter. "Father's last request was that I find you, find a way to bring the families back together. But how do you tell someone their entire family history is built on secrets?" The Simon & Garfunkel record had ended, the needle scratching softly against the label. In the silence, Sarah could hear the muffled sounds of the party continuing without them, completely unaware of the earthquake happening in the library. "My mother never knew," Sarah asked, her voice small. According to the letter, Marie made father promise never to tell. She wanted Helen to grow up without the shadow of scandal, without questioning who she was. Sarah moved to the window, watching her reflection overlap with the darkness outside. Grandmother must have known. It explains so much. Why she stayed in touch with me secretly, why she taught me everything about this world. She was protecting me, preparing me. For this moment, Richard said softly. How she knew someday the truth would come out. Sarah turned back to him, really looking at him for the first time. She could see it now, the shape of his jaw, the way he held himself, family traits that had passed down through hidden branches of a complicated tree. The night my father died, she said slowly, Grandmother came to the hospital. I remember her talking to my mother in whispers, something about, it's time to end this, tell her the truth. But then she saw me watching and stopped. Richard stepped closer, uncertainty written across his face. I don't expect anything from you, Sarah. You don't owe this family anything. I needed you to know. Why tonight? Why this elaborate scheme? I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks. Every morning at the diner, I'd walk in with the intention of explaining everything. And every morning I'd lose my nerve. This party, I convinced myself it was about making amends. But really, I was just being a coward, hiding behind social games instead of telling you the truth. Sarah looked down at her dress, her grandmother's dress, understanding now why Elizabeth had been so insistent that she learn everything about this world. It hadn't been about social climbing or maintaining appearances. It had been about preparing her for the day when the past finally caught up with the present. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the library. Somewhere in the main hall, the party was beginning to wind down. What do we do now? Sarah asked, voicing the question that hung heavy in the air. Richard ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, messing it up in a way that made him look more human, more real. That depends on you. We could forget this conversation ever happened, go back to our separate lives, or we could try to fix what was broken, not just between our families, but everything. The days following the party brought changes no one could have predicted. Sarah continued working at the diner, but now Richard would come in each morning, not as the arrogant businessman, but as family trying to make up for lost time. He'd sit at the counter, drinking coffee that had improved considerably since he started actually tasting it. You don't have to keep coming here, Sarah told him one quiet morning, refilling his cup. I'm not going to disappear. I know, he replied, watching the regulars greet her with genuine affection. But I want to understand your world the way you've understood mine. James Canterbury became a regular too, his weathered face softening whenever Sarah was near. He'd bring old photographs, sharing stories about the family Sarah had never known she had. The other waitresses watched this unusual parade of wealth and privilege with bewilderment, but Sarah maintained her balance between both worlds with characteristic grace. One evening, as Sarah closed up the diner, Richard waited outside in his Mercedes. I want to show you something, he said, opening the passenger door. The car's interior smelled of leather and subtle cologne. They drove through the city, past the familiar streets of Sarah's neighborhood, through the historic districts, until they reached a stately building with granite columns. The Museum of Fine Arts stood quiet in the evening light, closed to the public hours ago. Richard, what are we doing here? He pulled out a key. Being family has its privileges. I'm on the board of trustees. He led her up the steps. You said you wanted to work in a museum, to share the beauty your grandmother showed you. Inside, their footsteps echoed through empty galleries. Richard guided her to a specific wing where Renaissance masterpieces hung in perfect lighting. The museum is creating a new position, he said, stopping before a Botticelli, director of educational programs, someone to make art accessible to everyone, not just those who grew up with it. The board is very interested in candidates who understand both worlds. Sarah stared at him. Richard, it's not nepotism, he said quickly. Your degree is incomplete. Will be complete. I've arranged for you to finish your last 2 classes at Boston University. Evening classes. so you can keep working at the diner if you want to. The job will wait." Sarah touched the wall beside the Botticelli, steadying herself. "Why?" "Because you deserve it. Because Grandmother Elizabeth prepared you for more than just one night at a party. Because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because families are supposed to help each other reach their dreams." In the quiet gallery, surrounded by centuries of art, Sarah felt the weight of generations, the choices made, the secrets kept, the dreams deferred, but also the possibility of redemption, of bridges being rebuilt. "There's one condition," Richard said softly. "What's that?" "You have to help me learn to dance properly. I can't keep embarrassing the family at social functions." Sarah laughed, the sound bouncing off marble floors and gilded frames. "Deal. But you have to tell me the real reason you keep coming to the diner for that terrible coffee." Richard's face flushed slightly. "You haven't noticed. Jenny, the waitress with the red hair, she doesn't treat me like I'm Richard Anderson of Anderson Enterprises. She treats me like I'm just a guy who doesn't know how to order a decent breakfast." "Jenny?" Sarah's eyes widened. "My Jenny?" The pieces were falling into place. Jenny's recent complaints about the annoying rich guy who kept trying to make small talk, who seemed genuinely interested in her opinions about everything from music to politics. "Does she know who you really are?" "No," Richard admitted. "And I have no idea how to tell her." "I don't suppose you'd have any advice about bridging those two worlds?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all her grandmother's lessons, seeing them in a new light. "As a matter of fact, I do." On a crisp October evening in 1985, the ballroom of Anderson Manor was once again filled with music and laughter. But this time it was different. Alongside Boston's elite stood waitresses from Mel's Diner, their families, and students from Sarah's new museum education program. Sarah wore her grandmother's Dior again, but now it felt less like armor and more like a cherished heirloom. She watched as Richard attempted to teach Jenny how to waltz, both of them laughing as they stumbled through the steps. Jenny had taken the revelation of Richard's identity surprisingly well, after making him promise to never leave her a $100 tip for coffee again. James Canterbury sat in a corner, surrounded by a new generation of family, sharing stories with Sarah's mother, Helen, who had finally learned the truth about her father. There had been tears, anger, and ultimately, forgiveness. The orchestra struck up a familiar tune, time after time, and the dance floor filled with couples. Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder. "May I have this dance?" Richard asked, having temporarily abandoned his lessons with Jenny. "I've been practicing." Sarah took his offered hand. "Let's see if those lessons paid off." They moved across the floor with considerably more grace than their first dance months ago. Sarah caught glimpses of their reflections in the ballroom's mirrors, niece and uncle all friends, two people who had found family in the most unexpected way. You know," Richard said as they danced, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I was such a jerk that day at the diner." "Really? If I hadn't been trying to humiliate you, I might never have learned about humility myself." He guided her through a turn that would have been impossible for him 6 months ago. "You taught me that true class has nothing to do with money. And you taught me that it's never too late to heal old wounds," Sarah replied. "Grandmother would have loved this. All of us together, no more secrets." As the song ended, Jenny appeared at Richard's elbow. "Mind if I cut in? Someone promised to show me how to do that fancy spin thing." Sarah stepped back, watching as Richard took Jenny's hand. Their dance was less polished but full of joy, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that had nothing to do with social status or family names. Near the refreshment table, Sarah overheard two society matrons whispering, "Can you believe the changes in Richard Anderson? And that waitress he's dancing with, she's absolutely charming. They say love changes people." Sarah smiled, remembering her grandmother's words about kindness being more powerful than judgment. Elizabeth had been right. True grace wasn't about having everything, but about sharing what you had with others. The night wore on, and Sarah found herself on the terrace where she and Richard had first begun to understand each other. The autumn air was cool, but this time she didn't feel alone. Inside, the orchestra played one last song, Moon River, the same tune that had sparked love between her parents all those years ago. Through the windows, she could see Richard and Jenny swaying together, her mother and James Canterbury sharing a tearful embrace. Waitresses and socialites mingling without concern for status or background. Sarah touched the silk of her grandmother's dress, feeling the weight of its history and the lightness of its future. Elizabeth Canterbury had known that someday the barriers between these worlds would fall, that love would prove stronger than pride, that kindness would outlast cruelty. A shooting star streaked across the sky, brief, brilliant, and beautiful. Sarah made a wish, not for herself, but for all of them, that they would remember this night not as an end to an old story, but as the beginning of a new one. The party that had been meant to humiliate a waitress had instead transformed into a celebration of redemption, of barriers broken, of love found in unexpected places. And somewhere, Sarah was sure, her grandmother was smiling. As the last guests departed, Sarah stood in the grand foyer, no longer feeling out of place. She belonged here now, not because of hidden family connections or social status, but because she had helped build a bridge between two worlds that had been separate for far too long. Richard and Jenny were the last to leave, hand in hand, their future as unplanned and perfect as the path that had brought them together. Sarah watched them go, thinking about how sometimes the cruelest intentions could lead to the kindest outcomes, how love could bloom in the most unlikely places, and how, in the end, it wasn't about which world you came from, but what you chose to make of the world you found yourself in. Thank you for watching today's story. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to relive the magic of the 80s every day with our heartfelt stories. May God bless you and your family, and don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another totally rad story you won't want to miss. See you in the next video, and stay awesome.